Hey guys, welcome to the ride. My name is Gage, and in today's video, we are going to be looking at Ghosts of Saltmarsh, which is a collection of nautical adventures for 5th edition D&D. Just to premise the video, this is not a comprehensive review of everything that is in this book. This is a initial impressions video of sorts. I maybe only played through a quarter of the main story. However, I have used the book as a source book for other little adventures as well. So what you guys are going to get is my initial impressions of Ghosts of Saltmarsh, and from that you can decide if you want to run it yourself or if a DM is offering to run it for you if this is a game that you might be interested in playing. So to start, I'm just going to kind of spoil my own opinion. I personally love Ghosts of Saltmarsh. I think it's a really cool book for D&D. I think it adds a lot of cool stuff. There's a few things that it kind of doesn't talk about, but for the most part, this is a really solid book, at least as far as I've seen. Now, I want to point out something about Ghosts of Saltmarsh, which is that it is a fantastic engine for creating your own adventures. I'm going to bring this up as my first positive about the book itself, which is that there's a ton of tables, charts, maps. There's all kinds of things that you can use as a DM to create your own nautical adventures for your players. There are a ton of options for ships, for how they work in combat and adventuring, and also how to create adventures based around those. I'm going to kind of throw things out that are positive and negatives at the same time, and just hopefully my opinion by the end kind of comes out. When I say that this is a fantastic engine for adventures, what I mean is that there's a lot of cool things the DM can use, but that said, there's not a lot of adventuring stuff that the game gives you to start off with. Let me give you an example. The main first section of Ghosts of Saltmarsh talks about the city of Saltmarsh, which is a really awesome, fleshed out location. There's a lot of really cool NPCs, although some are more interesting than others. What's really cool is that Saltmarsh feels like a living city. And as a DM, you can take as much from the book as you want, or take some liberties and make a few things up as you go along. There's rules in here for how the townsfolk behave to the players, depending on what kind of catch there was that day, whether the fishermen brought in a large batch of fish or brought in very few fish. The general morale of the town will go up or down. This is the same thing with your crew members aboard the pirate ships and sailing ships that the book offers. Your crew has morale, and that can go up or down depending on what the players do. Now, there's a set system for this. However, nothing is stopping you as the DM from role-playing these things out, from allowing the players to try and increase the morale in their own way and deciding whether or not that does so. Now, a big criticism that a lot of people have toward Ghosts of Saltmarsh is the adventures themselves and how they don't really deal with the sailing or piracy or hunting on the high seas for the most part at all. This is a pretty huge criticism. There's a video by XP to level 3, and he's a bit harsher than I'm going to be to Ghosts of Saltmarsh. However, I do still see it as a valid critique that the actual adventures of Ghosts of Saltmarsh don't really take advantage of the high seas theme. Now, there's kind of an issue with branding when it comes to Ghosts of Saltmarsh. If you've seen this book at a game store and you know nothing about it, from the look of the front, you would think that every adventure has to do with getting a boat and fighting sea monsters and fighting pirates and going on epic adventures in the high seas and, searching for buried treasure and doing all those things that we've seen pirates do in the movies and in the games and stuff like that. However, that's not really the case with the written adventures. Most of them take place in or around Saltmarsh. There's a few adventures that go beyond it, but even those can become landlocked. And the criticisms held towards Ghosts of Saltmarsh are correct in that regard. And I don't want to try and defend the lack of sailing adventures in this book. However, what I will say is that the fun that I have had with Ghosts of Saltmarsh has edged out problems I have with the narrative. Now again, I haven't fully completed this book, and I'll kind of tell you why. So the first adventure deals with the players finding out that there is a sort of haunted house nearby Saltmarsh. They go to it and find out that it's a smuggling den and have to take out the smugglers, and the smugglers run to their boats, and the players go down and get to their boats, kill the smugglers, and now they have a potential vessel that they can use in future games. That's a really cool initial adventure, and what I realized is that it's cool because we made it cool as a party. I'll tell you what my players did. My players went to the haunted house, this Saltmarsh manor, and they fought with a few smugglers, but didn't give chase when the smugglers began to run off. The book doesn't really account for the players not wanting to pursue and just wanting to kind of explore. And so logically, as the DM, I figured, well, they would know that their smuggling operation is probably compromised, and they would try to bail out. So in my game, the smugglers bailed out from Saltmarsh Manor and then fired at it with their weapons aboard their ship, leading the players to have to retreat and try and find a new way of getting to these smugglers. The smugglers themselves ran off in their ship, and that led to a whole thing where the players found a captain in the town and went on a ship and got a crew and sailed down, and this is all just in the first adventure. Ghosts of Saltmarsh, I believe, has 7 adventures total, and this is just the first one, and it's become basically the campaign for my players, which has been super awesome. Now, just a few critiques that I have about Ghosts of Saltmarsh. One of the biggest being, it's not a very DM-friendly game, and that's not really the problem of Saltmarsh. Really, it's just a problem of circumstance. Saltmarsh is a really big town that's been really fleshed out and has all kinds of characters with shops and different things, and the book does a good job of putting it all into one chapter so you can easily reference it, but there are a lot of NPCs to manage, definitely. And if you want them all to have character and be unique in your town, that can be difficult, especially for a newer DM. And finally, I'll just add my critique to those that have already been said before, which is that the actual story of Ghosts of Saltmarsh is pretty stale. There's not a lot in terms of a consistent villain, and to be fair, Ghosts of Saltmarsh isn't technically a all-in-one contained campaign story. There's actually several adventures that are tied together loosely, with Saltmarsh being something of a hub for the characters to come back to. They're kind of expected to care about Saltmarsh and want to save it. And that can be a really big problem if your characters don't care about Saltmarsh. The book doesn't really give you a good reason to, and it especially doesn't give your players a good reason to either. It's a cool location, but there's nobody in there worth saving. A lot of the characters in Saltmarsh have shady backstories and secret dealings with other organizations, and because of that, everybody kind of doesn't trust everybody, which makes sense for a pirate-themed campaign. In my game, the players took a captain with them to go on their voyage to find the smugglers. However, that captain was part of the Scarlet Brotherhood, which is a creepy cult in the game. And while out, there were a few members of the crew and of the players who were actually siding with a different faction. And that led to a crazy stalemate where both sides knew they wanted to kill each other, but both sides also knew that they really couldn't until they'd taken care of the smugglers. Which is such an interesting and tense background for a story, and it's been that way ever since the players began to find out what was actually going on. Now, I've rambled on quite a bit about Ghosts of Saltmarsh, but the bottom line is that this is one of my favorite adventures that I've run. It just has so much variety and so many tools that the DM can use to give the players a really cool story of their own. Like I said before, one of my biggest problems with Ghosts of Saltmarsh is really the way it was sort of sold. On the back it says Adventure on the High Seas, and if you play by the adventures in the book, that's really not the case. If you want to play Ghosts of Saltmarsh as a pirate adventure, you really need to fill in those gaps yourself. I really wish they'd sold this game as a source book and not an adventure. I feel like if they did that, a lot of DMs and players would better understand what Saltmarsh actually is, and the adventures could be fun as long as the players understand that most of the high seas adventuring will happen on their own time and not on the book's time. Anyway, I hope this was really informative for you. I will probably try and make like a final thoughts video once we actually finish the entire campaign of Saltmarsh, although, as said before, our campaign's kind of gone off the rails a bit, which is awesome. And maybe by that time I'll have a different opinion on it, but right now I think Ghosts of Saltmarsh is definitely worth your time, and you should definitely check it out if you want some great tools to help you have high seas adventures with your players. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the future if you'd like to see more of these first thought videos. I'll try and make a few for the different campaigns that I've run characters through, and maybe I'll make a few final thoughts videos to see if my initial impressions change over time. Thank you guys again, and I will see you in the next video.